as we all know, has had some wonderful trips, and today he's going to talk about one of them. So, I think one of them. So, without any further ado, I'd like to introduce, during my first year, our first speaker, Geoff Bransbury.
Some of you have seen me talk before about my various trips around the world. Some of you haven't. This one, first of all, I want to introduce my bike. This is a Zulo. It's that's Spanish for blue. Azul is Spanish for blue, so it's bluey, you see. My first trip was through South America. So I've done 90,000 kilometres now, approximately. And so briefly, my first trip was in fact from Buenos Aires to Los Angeles, that one, there, and right the way through. Then the second one, which is the big one, was Vladivostok to London. I've spoken to you about this one a couple of years ago, I think.
Yeah.
The one I'm talking about today is this one, which from Nova Scotia to Los Angeles, and then last year I went around Australia, so I've actually been grounded, which is really rather sad. So there's not going to be any more trips, which is heartbreaking, you know. Terrible. So you won't have to put up with me again. For those of you who don't know how all this started, it started when I was about 66. I'm 73 now. My daughter was in South America, and I was talking to her on Skype. I'd recently retired, and I didn't know what to do with myself. And I was talking to her on Skype, and she had met this South African guy that was riding from New York to Patagonia, and I said to her, "Oh, Lucy, that sounds fantastic." And she said, "Well, Dad, why don't you do it? Get off your backside, do it." So the screen went dead, and I went out that very day and bought a motorbike. And you can imagine the reaction when I got home. What? Anyway, my wife's been very supportive throughout all this, although she has grounded me now. So, if I can work this thing, hang on. Yeah, this was me when I was 18. I don't know if you can see this picture, but I wasn't biking one. You can't really see that, but he's wearing a bowler hat, and I was taking him down to the yeah. So that's the only picture I've got of me on my early motorbike.
You going to the office with?
I was taking him to the office. Yes, I was taking him to the office. He had his umbrella as well. It's beautiful, isn't it? Now you might not. I'm going to divert for a second, but you might not realise that I'm not the only biker in the room. Now, guess who that is? 1959, riding a Vespa around Europe. He's in this room today. Any ideas? Don't you like the hat? Can you see the hat? Beautiful hat, lovely bag, beautiful. So would he stand up, please?
Rod.
No, it's not Rod. John Howe. Yes.
Very good.
And now who's this? There's another one too, but you might know who this is.
Noel.
Our very own dapper Noel. He's not here today. Doesn't he look dapper there on his motorbike? That was taken in France somewhere, apparently, in 1951. So anyway, back to today. This trip started in Nova Scotia. I'm not going to talk to you about any of the big cities, so I'm a little bit about Houston perhaps, but no, so we're not going to hear about Reuben sandwiches in New York or anything like that. You know all that. So I'm going to talk to you about some of the things that, in the more out of the way places that I went to on my bike. And some of the things I find interesting, maybe I hope you will, a few historical bits and pieces. There's a lot of history here, and I love history, so I'm going to bore you a bit with American history, plus a few other oddball things that happen along the way. So that's what I'm going to do. It's the things that I find interesting, basically, and I hope you do. So I started off. I'm taking a step back. It started off the previous year. It started off the end of my last trip in Vladivostok to London, and there's me and outside the Parliament building, and my bike. Then poor old Zulo spent the next 9 months with my poor friend in Kent. You know, he lost his garage. So I went back to England and picked him up, and they were very pleased to get their garage back, as you see. So bye-bye. Very pleased to get rid of him. And so there's off. Zulo is now going off to Canada. And there's the Zulo in its BMW box. Actually, I flew it from London to to Halifax in Canada. And it's BMW box. So there's Halifax. Now, Barry spoke a bit about Halifax a couple of weeks ago. It was settled in about 1840, so 1740. And it was originally Scottish, very Scottish, a Scottish colony. But it's got two claims to fame, really. The first claim was that it was the dumping ground for the unclaimed bodies from the Titanic. There was 150 apparently unclaimed bodies from the Titanic that are buried in the cemetery. The other amazing thing that happened in Halifax happened in 1917. There was this massive explosion. A French munition ship blew up in Halifax and killed over 2,000 people. Totally devastated the country. And I don't know if you can read this, but it's just an incredible situation. The Mont Blanc, 6 million pounds of iron hull tossed 1,000 feet in the air. Isn't that amazing?
Sure.
Yes. Sonic boom, 13,320 miles per hour. And on it goes. Carbon saturated black rain fell for 10 minutes. The entire town was completely destroyed. Amazing, isn't it? So, what we don't know about. So anyway, this is the trip I did. The first part of the trip, I went round Nova Scotia, then over to St. John, New Brunswick, up to Quebec City, through Montreal, Ottawa and Toronto. Barry showed you again some slides of Nova Scotia, so I'm not going to labour this, but it's a really, really beautiful place. I wish I'd had more time there. And Philip has worked actually, didn't you, Philip, up in Newfoundland. So if you want to know more about it, just talk to Philip. But it's a lovely place. It was Nova Scotia was first settled by the French in 1608. The Arcadians, they were called then. It was the Scottish colony, and then there was six wars between the British and the French that carried on, and there was eventually it was ceded to Britain in 1713, so it became a British colony after the War of Spanish Succession. All the poor old Arcadians were kicked out. They all had to take an oath of allegiance, and if they didn't, they were shipped out. 80% of the French population of Nova Scotia was shipped out and dumped in Louisiana and the colonies of America. Amazing, isn't it? They were allowed back again afterwards, after the war, the next war. But it's amazing what went on. Very cruel. But it's a really, really beautiful place, as you see. Very colourful and very lovely. You notice there the old British flag before the St Patrick's Cross was in there. A lot of what they call the Empire Loyalists that didn't want to stay, they wanted to stay British, they all came up here to Nova Scotia and over to New Brunswick. Over 40,000 of them went over to New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, and they're still quite very proud of it too. So I learned about I had my first day in Airbnb here. Has anyone used Airbnbs? Yeah. They're fantastic. That was beautiful. That was my first one. My second one was a family, and they had motorbikes and the whole family. They're wonderful places to stay if you're on your own. And here's this little boy putting the Canadian flag on my bike. He's so proud of it. That's rather sweet. So on I went through to Quebec. Now, quite interesting. First of all, I crossed on the ferry, the Bay of Fundy, to New St. John's. And interesting here, it's a very narrow bay. And the first thing you find, there's a very famous, what they call the reversing river in St. John. And it's a bit like the horizontal falls in is it Northern Territory? It's the same thing. There's a big tide, and the water literally flows right up the river. When the tide comes in, it completely reverses the flow of the river and goes several miles up the river in the wrong way. And of course the birds, you can see them there. The birds are having a field day in the middle of I mean, it's much more impressive in real life, I have to say. It's a very interesting place. Apparently this is the biggest in the world, the biggest dip, this drop. It's over 5 metre drop when it goes down reverses. The typical New Brunswick scenery, for anyone who hasn't been there, it's just like Siberia. So it reminded me of my trip through Russia, because it's really just the same. It's just that the only difference is the roads. Beautiful roads. There are no bumps on those roads. But then you've got these wonderful bridges. That's the Harland Bridge, 1,200 metres. It's the longest in the world, I believe, covered bridge. It's beautiful, isn't it? And there's a Zulu behind. You can see how long that bridge is. So the other thing you see, we see kangaroos here, but you see moose there. Moose. Moose. And into Quebec. Now the thing that...
Did you see any moose?
No, not a single moose.
No, we looked for moose for a couple of days, but
no moose. They're around somewhere, but you don't see dead moose like you see kangaroos on the road going around Australia. That would be rather... It wouldn't be good to run over a dead moose, would it? But anyway, that's the Quebec flag. And if you're an Anglo-Canadian, you get really fed up with the French Canadians. I don't think you have any in this room. Because they never fly the Canadian flag in Quebec. You only ever see this. You see the Canadian flag on the odd government building. You go into restaurants in Quebec. Quebec, only 30% of Quebec City population is bilingual. And so it's more French than the French. And trying to find an English menu is pretty hard in Quebec City. And the other thing, of course, is the road signs don't have any English. In English-speaking Quebec, in the English-speaking provinces, there's English and French. But in the French part of Canada, French only. So it drives you around the bend if you're Anglo-Canadian rather. Now Quebec City, anyone been to Quebec City? A lot of you. It's a lovely city, isn't it?
It is.
It's a really beautiful city. That's the Hotel Frontenac, which is the same over the other side of Canada. It was built for the Canadian Pacific Railways. I believe it's the one in, is it Banff or Lake Louise? I haven't remember myself. Is it? Yeah, very, very expensive. Churchill and Roosevelt met there during the war and had their parleys in Quebec. But I think Quebec is one of the most beautiful cities in the world. It's absolutely beautiful. It's of course very, very French. That's the oldest building in Quebec. It's a very pretty city. Now you all know the Niagara Falls. It's wonderful, wonderful. The only trouble with the Niagara Falls is where it is, because the other side of that picture is that the actual Niagara is a really grotty sort of town. If you ever go there's a lovely place not far from it called Niagara by the Lake, which is only a few kilometres up the road. It's a lovely little town. And in fact, the guys from Mississauga took me out for dinner there, which is really nice. So they're very nice people. So it was July 4th that I crossed into the US, and I went down through the Finger Lakes, which was a lovely part of New York State. There's all these lakes, you can't really see them there, they're like fingers. Very attractive, very nice wine growing area. And then through to the Amish country, Gettysburg, Harper's Ferry, and Charlottesville. So, and what I love about America, there's a couple of things I love about America. I love the way they put the flag. I love that. They're proud of their flag, and as some of you might know, I'm a bit of a, I love the flag, and I love it to be clean and bright. And I got so annoyed a few years ago when the flag on top of Flinders Street Station was just an old black rag, and I got so angry with this that the Lord Mayor was on the 774 on the radio. So Geoff from Bow Morris rang up and said, "Lord Mayor, the flag is a disgrace on top of Flinders Street Station." It was changed that day. So people power works, you know. That was work. Anyway, I love the way the Americans do it. The other thing I like about America is their yellow buses. All those little things. You know,
School buses, yeah.
All the school buses. Very uncomfortable, I'm sure, but they're lovely. And Amish country is extraordinary. Has anyone been through Amish country? Oh, a lot of you. A lot of you. What?
Stayed there.
Stayed there?
Yeah, you can stay in the town.
Oh, okay.
Lancaster.
Yeah, Lancaster. But it is, in this day and age, there's about 300,000 Amish or Mennonites mainly in Ohio and Pennsylvania, and they were a persecuted group in Switzerland originally, and their whole way of life is to retain the old ways and not to show wealth or anything like that. So they don't want to be connected, so that's why they don't have electricity. They have solar electricity, they don't have electricity through wires. And they don't have telephones, but they can have mobile phones. The children, their children's dolls don't have faces. It's very strange. And they have their rules. They have lots of different communities, and they all have their rules through a governing body of rules that each community has. But the kids, when they get to about 18, they have a year called Rumspringa, and they're allowed to do whatever they like. They're allowed to go up to New York, they're allowed to do whatever they like, get drunk, anything. And if they then have to make a decision to get baptized into the Amish faith or to leave. And apparently about something like 80% of them choose to go back to their Amish way, Amish life. So the communities continue to retain and grow in actual fact. There's really more. If you leave once you've been baptized, though, you're shunned, and that's the big fear. If you almost can't leave. You have this 1 year of freedom, and you've got to make a decision. And if you make a decision to stay, that's for life. And they really are quite extraordinary. So then after that, I went off to Gettysburg, and I'm sure a lot of you have been to Gettysburg, but that was the beginning of the end for General Lee in the Battle of Gettysburg. And the famous was the Pickett's Charge, where where the Confederates, 12,500 soldiers, rushed across that field, and at least half of them were killed. And that was basically the end of the beginning of the end for the South. And the next day, that they lost Vicksburg in the South, and that was on the Mississippi. So that was the beginning of the end for them. The Americans do these things so well. You know, if they always get a film and you get your audio tour, or you get a tour. If you go to the Battle of Waterloo, there's just nothing there. Nothing. Of course, it's Belgium, isn't it? It's not a Belgian victory. So, but anyway, it's very frustrating when you go to places like Waterloo and there's no history there. The thing I found interesting, they have this thing called a cyclorama, which was the way they showed. They didn't have cameras and things. This cyclorama is a circular painting of the whole battle, like the what's that thing about Battle of Hastings, the Bayeux Tapestry. Oh. Except it's not a tapestry, it's a painting.
They have a diorama at Waterloo also.
They do. In fact, that's the next slide. Well, would you like to come up and take over? Yeah, they showed it in Melbourne. Were you there? In 1889. They showed the Battle of Waterloo, the cyclorama.
Got one in Moscow too.
Okay.
It's fantastic.
In Moscow?
Yeah, if you ever go there.
Oh, I missed that.
The only thing they ever got is Putin.
Yeah, another little person I saw. Yes. And then I went to a few battles. I won't bore you with them all, but the Harper's Ferry was interesting. Harper's Ferry is on the junction of Potomac and the Shenandoah rivers, and there was a battle there where General Lee, in fact, captured 12,000 Union troops. It was the biggest number of Union troops captured at any one time by the South, and this was before Gettysburg. But more interesting than that, and that's Harper's Ferry, lovely little town, but it's John Brown. You know John Brown from John Brown's Bodies? That was as he was depicted by the Confederates. John Brown was an abolitionist he apparently lit the fire of the Civil War, apparently, before, about the 1830s. And he tried to organise a slave mutiny in Harper's Ferry. And here's a picture of him. Here's a picture of what he actually looked like. So he's a hero of the North, a terrorist of the South, and he was hanged in 1859. He was captured at Harper's Ferry. And you know how many children he had? He had 20 children.
Oh, busy boy.
20 children. 10 of them made it to adult statehood, and 2 were killed with him. Oh, he wasn't killed, but 2. Actually, I don't know how many wives. Good question. At least 2, I think. Maybe 3. Maybe 4. Lots. I'll look it up. But fascinating. Another piece of American history is at Charlottesville, was Monticello. That's Thomas Jefferson's home in Monticello in Charlottesville. And Jefferson was an amazing man. He was the president of, he also wrote the Declaration of Independence. And he built this house. He was an architect, he was a clockmaker, he was a poet, he was a wine buff, Roger, he would do one of the wine group. He was
next meeting.
But you know, he had 200 slaves. He wrote the 200 slaves. He wrote the Declaration of Independence, where, you know, all men are equal. So, you know, what applied to him didn't seem to apply. But I suppose I did a tour of this Monticello, and I was dying to ask that question about how could you justify writing those wonderful flowery words about, you know, all men are equal when you hold 200 slaves. And I had the wrong accent, you know, I thought I better not ask that question. But somebody did, and the guide said, well, you know, he was very anti-slavery, Thomas Jefferson, very anti-slavery. But it was just too complicated, so he left that to another generation. I had to chuckle to myself. But I guess you can't judge, you know, 17th century attitudes with 21st century views, can you? He's an amazing man. He's buried there, but all his relatives could be buried. If you're a relative of Thomas Jefferson, you can be buried here at Monticello. So he didn't really practice what he preached in my book. So then up from Charlottesville, it's a really beautiful country this, I took to the Blue Ridge Mountains. Everyone been down the Blue Ridge Mountain? Yeah? A few of you? Gosh. Very nice, isn't it? Beautiful. Yes. It goes about, that's right, it's a country road. John Denver sits about West Virginia, you know. I should play that in the background, shouldn't I? But that's what it looks like. It's very beautiful. It goes about 700 or 800 kilometres right down the spine of the Appalachian Mountains. Very beautiful. That's what it looks like. The only trouble is when you're riding a motorbike, that's actually all you see. You see trees. So I actually, in fact, got off it and rode on the normal roads after a while. But, you know, it's nature, that's my spot tracker, which is a safety device that allegedly saves me if I fall off the bike. But, now, at the base of, you won't be able to read that slide, at the base of the Blue Ridge Mountains, there's a town called Asheville. And I love the description of it. It's one of the world's top 12 must-see destinations. The Paris of the South, the San Francisco of the East, America's happiest city, one of the 10 most beautiful places in America, best place to reinvent your life, best place to retire, not easily forgotten once visited. You've got to go, haven't you? It's quite nice, but I think it's a little over-exaggerated. I went to, you get lovely bluegrass music in the bars there. It's lovely. But it is in a beautiful place. But one of the most incredible place at Asheville is the Biltmore. And look at that as a house. Now the Biltmore Estate in Asheville, it was built by what was in there? The Vanderbilt, George Vanderbilt, in about 1897. And the money came from Cornelius Vanderbilt, who was the railroad magnate. And this place is amazing. It matches anything I've ever seen in France. It's 255 rooms, and it's packed with magnificent things like Renoir paintings and Ming Dynasty things, tapestries, Dutch tapestries, you name it. Now, old George Biltmore, when he built it for his wife and his child, 3 of them. You think he had a bit too much money? Dudley died. He died in 1914 or 15 or 16, and so he only had a very few years in that magnificent property. It's of course open to the public now. It's still owned by the family, funnily enough. But it is beautiful. There's the Zulo.
How many wives did he have to fill that place?
George,
Yeah.
he only had one. Yeah, he only had one. He only had one child. That was. Yes.
Big job there.
Yeah, well, he had lots of money. But, it's absolutely stunning. It really is. It's, as you can see, it matches anything that I've ever seen. So there I went through the Great Smoky Mountains, Daniel Boone's country and all that, and over to Nashville. And I'm sure a lot of you have been to Nashville, but I'll tell you what, I was really disappointed with Nashville. I mean, that's the Batman building. And I love this. Nashville strikes me, this is contentious, it's one of those places where you have to go and pretend you're having fun, you know? You've got to pretend you're having a great time in Nashville, so everyone running around thinking, oh, this is fantastic, having a wonderful time. But it's really, I reckon, a grotty old place. I hardly heard any blues music or what is it, country. It's all ghetto blaster. They all have, every bar has a ghetto blaster, and they're all blasting out of as loud as they can possibly do to outdo the other ghetto blasters. So it's just an awful place. That's my opinion. So I'm sorry, Nashville, I didn't like you. But I did like the Johnny Cash Museum. That was fun. And his lovely boots. And where? Only in America. Only in America. You can get a full-size Parthenon. Yeah, it's full-size. At Nashville, yes. It's extraordinary. But it's not in white marble. It's sort of that bits of stone on concrete, you know, and it's sort of yellow. So it's nothing like Parthenon, but it's the same size.
It's
complete.
Well, no, you probably should blow it up. It would probably be better. So anyway, on to Memphis. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm a great Elvis fan. Who else? Yeah, I'm an Elvis fan. And so I had to go.
Graceland.
Yeah, I had to go to Graceland. Who's been to Graceland? Yeah, a few of you. Yes, very impressive. So there's Graceland, there's Zulo outside, similar blues there, outside Graceland. And guess where I stayed? The Heartbreak Hotel. And guess what street it's in?
I was very near the end.
Isn't it funny? Isn't it funny? I'll tell you what, by the time you leave Memphis, you don't want to ever hear another Elvis song, you know. But no, it's wonderful. There's Graceland, and actually it's a beautiful house. It's a really lovely southern mansion, and it's not nearly as well. It is actually. It's going to say it's ostentatious, but outside it's not ostentatious. And in fact, when you first go in, there's that. You see that's the dining room, and it's really very un-Elvis-like, the dining room. And apparently, it's the mother. You know, the mother was insisted on having a nice dining room. She wasn't going to let her son ruin it with all the stuff he did. That's where Elvis lived. You know, all those sort of places. That's Elvis, isn't it? Yes. So all those, and he's got his plane out the back, and of course his cars. So it's a wonderful place to visit, and I loved it. And from there, of course, also the Sun Studio is in Memphis. That's where Roy Orbison and Elvis, in fact, all sang there. All the greats. That's where Elvis stood and sang his first. What was his first song? That's all right. That's all right. That's all right. No, that was his first song. Yes. So he sang that there, John. Yeah. So, and after that, I went, of course, on the Elvis tour. I went down to Tupelo, which is where he was born. So I was heading now down into Mississippi, and that was Elvis's house. Now, very interesting. When I was in Tupelo, I had to get the bike serviced. So now my bike's a Kawasaki, but I couldn't find any Kawasaki dealer. But I found a Honda dealer eventually. I went in there and asked if they would, change the oil and do a bit of this and that. And the guy that was the manager of the Honda dealership was very interested in what I was doing, my trip. And he in fact took me around. He just left the bike in the service area, and he took me around Tupelo and to Elvis's place, and also Elvis's church. And he told me always a lot of stories about the Presleys. And he said, you know, the Presleys are still around. He said, you know, the uncles and, you know, grandparents. He said, they're a terrible lot. He said, they're a terrible lot. He wouldn't meddle with the Presleys, he said. They're a rough lot. So, yeah, yes. So from Tupelo, I headed down to Mississippi and down to Vicksburg. Now, Vicksburg's another battlefield site. Now, I'm just going to sort of dwell a moment, because what struck me about the South is how you cannot get away from the history. You cannot get away from battlefields. But more than that, you cannot get away from the Civil War and the aftermath of the Civil War. And I've done a bit of research since. It sort of got into me a bit, because I found it fascinating. I didn't manage to speak about this to many black people, but I spoke to a lot of white people. And there's almost this sort of deep-seated resentment in the South. You know, they sort of were. The South in 1865 was beaten, but they were defiant still. And after the Civil War in 1865, it's an incredible situation. The South was completely devastated. There was 120,000 or 300,000 white boys, mainly white boys, had been killed. That's one hell of a percentage of the population of young males in the South. 40% of the animals were destroyed. All the plantations were destroyed. Nobody had any money. All the cities had been destroyed. Atlanta was burned, and there was 4 million freed slaves. All of them unemployed, and it was a devastating situation. And if you sort of try and put yourself into 1865, and your whole lifestyle had been lost, and that's what was happening then. And then the next 20 years proved to be an absolute disaster. They called it the Reconstruction. So I'm not trying to give you too much of a history lesson here, but they call it Reconstruction. And fundamentally, there was two groups. There was the Democrats that really wanted a new South, with the blacks being integrated with the whites into a whole new world. And then there was the whites, the beaten whites, if you like, that really wanted to reinstate the status quo. And Congress was completely and utterly divided. And over the next 20 years, it literally the pendulum flew that way and then that way and that way. At first, the whites, Lincoln wanted the whites to amnesties and all this sort of thing. So that was President Johnson, because Lincoln was killed. That all happened there. They put an amnesty, and that was fine as far as the whites were concerned, but it wasn't really as far as the blacks were concerned. They did some incredible rules came in, whereby they passed rules in the States that if you were unemployed and a vagrant, you could be arrested. And of course all the blacks were unemployed and vagrants, so they were all arrested, not all of them, but there were a lot arrested, and then they were loaned out for nothing. So effectively slavery was reinstated again, under another word. It's quite incredible. Anyway, that went on for a few years, and then the pendulum swung the other way, and rules were passed to free slaves that they could vote, and suddenly the blacks got to vote, and so the state parliament and legislatures suddenly all became full of black people. Then it became huge resentment among the whites. That led to the Ku Klux Klan and terrible violence, massacres, and that led then to the troops being sent in. So the pendulum swung the other way, and then eventually there was a recession, and so the troops were taken out, and on it went. And then, of course, the final end of this Reconstruction was that the whites, in fact, got control. They passed terrible rules that effectively took the voter away from the blacks again. And that really where legalised segregation came from. And it sort of continued right the way through. And so when you go through the South, this is sort of all this undercurrent is still there. And anyone being there would agree with that.
Definitely.
It's fascinating. And I absolutely, I well recommend going there just to feel it. You don't feel it in the cities.
Can I just mention that there is a cruise from Memphis to New Orleans.
Right,
American Queen on another one as well.
right.
Very interesting. Go on. Much
Yeah.
better, big
Yes,
thing.
because you'd get a lot of talks about this sort of thing on those cruises, I suppose, wouldn't you? Anyway, so
I love the history of the Americans.
yeah, and I think it's fascinating. This is the last bit of history here. It was the USS Cairo, which was torpedoed at the Battle of Vicksburg. It was actually the first. It was a sort of gunboat, and it was actually the first boat that was ever torpedoed.
The other thing, Geoff, they call it Cairo.
What?
They call it Cairo.
A Cairo.
Cairo.
Cairo. Oh, sorry. Thank you. Thank you. I remember that. So there's now when you go down a bit further, you would have got to Natchez, I would think, Barry. But Natchez is an absolutely wonderful place, and it was really where the South was at its height. It was a hugely wealthy cotton port. So all these incredible mansions were built there. Real Scarlet O'Hara stuff. Look at them. Absolutely wonderful. It was actually founded originally by the French, and the French killed all the Indians, and the Indians killed all the French. So then it became a British colony, and eventually it became an American place. But of course, all the wealth. Natchez is one of the most wonderful cities. I'd never heard of it, frankly, but it's so beautiful. All this colonial, magnificent properties. So on the way, how are we doing for time? I've nearly finished. Actually, you'll find out in a minute that I'm not going to go much further than here, because something happened that stopped me going to. Because don't worry, I'm not going to go until 2 o'clock in the afternoon. But I went on there down to New Orleans. I'm not going to spend any time on New Orleans, other than to say it's not what it used to be, in my view. It's sort of this ghetto blast. I didn't see much jazz there.
No?
No, there used to be jazz. Yeah, and Bourbon Street is, just more ghetto blasters, but the Cajun food is wonderful, wonderful. But the thing to do there is to go on one of these. Yes, and the Everglades. They're absolutely fantastic. You go through the Everglades, and there's these alligators. You zoom around in those boats. This is what they call Spanish moss. It's on cedar trees. The Spanish call it French wig. The French call it Spanish beard. And Henry Ford, there's a lovely little story here. Henry Ford, back in the 20s, I think it must have been, cut all this down. Very clever. He cut the cedar trees down, which he made into boxes, which eventually became floorboards, and the Spanish moss was taken and became up in upholstery inside the cars. The only trouble was that they had little larvae in them, and people would be driving along and a maggot would come through the... So they had the biggest recall first big recall.
Probably better than a maggot.
Another beautiful plantation at Galeos. I'll skip through this in timing. In this one, again, they do it very well, but I couldn't help laughing. All dressed up beautifully, but she's got her water bottle.
It's better than the Coke bottle.
So I'm going to dodge through a few slides just because of time. But then I went through to the Gulf of Mexico, and this is the houses are on stilts there. Then across there, across to Galveston, and then to NASA's place in Houston, and all these magnificent rockets, and the lander and mission control. You can still go into the original mission control. Unfortunately, it was closed that day. Now, there's a very fine hotel in Houston.
Hey!
Very fine hotel. I recommend this hotel. It's Philip Harford's place, the son of our very own Peter Harford.
Very nice.
Yeah. But they're dangerous people. They took me out to the pub from 3 o'clock onwards. By 8 o'clock, I was finished. I think I could sort of
Wasted.
Yeah, absolutely. But a terrific bunch of Aussies. But they're, of course, typical Texas, because I don't know if you can see this, but yes. But we're drinking wine. They drink wine out of tumblers in Texas. You don't have a wine glass, you have a tumbler. Yeah. So from Houston to, one of the things you do in Texas, of course, is you must do in Texas is have a steak. Rib, absolutely fantastic. Oh, isn't that beautiful? Austin, Texas, nearly. So one other thing Americans do very well is they have their libraries. Each president has a library, and this is LBJ's library in Austin, which is a lovely city. One of the this is the Capitol building. Now, do you remember him, Davy Crockett? Davy Crockett, King of the Wild Frontier. Yeah. Well, yeah, it's Fess Parker. That's Fess Parker and Davy Crockett. Well, in that Capitol building, there is a portrait of Davy Crockett. Yes. This is Davy Crockett. He doesn't exactly look like Fess Parker. I'm sure most of us had raccoon hats at one stage in our life, didn't we? Yeah. And outside there in the middle of the street is Mrs. Angeline Eberly saved the archives of Houston. Lovely story. Sam Houston wanted to make Houston the capital of Texas, so he tried to pinch all the archives from Austin, and they did it in the middle of the night, and Angeline was there, and she saw this going on, so she got the gun out. They have a town gun. She fired the town gun, got everybody out of bed. And back to, sorry, that's the last, back to San Antonio, there's the Alamo. Remember the Alamo? Yeah. Now the Alamo itself is that, and it's rather disappointing. It's rather disappointing because it's sort of not like it is in the movie. Was in the movie. It's right. It's very small. And it's right in the middle of a car park, in the middle of San Antonio. But San Antonio is a lovely city. But they do have the other missions. It was one of 29 missions, and most of the other missions are actually much nicer than the Alamo. And that's one of them. Beautiful, beautiful. So very nearly got to the end of this presentation. This is the Big Bend National Park in Texas. It's right by the border with Mexico. Very beautiful. The Rio Grande River. And yeah, and there I met Chuck and his son. And but Chuck had a Hummer, and he let me drive it. Yes, I had a lovely drive. It's extraordinary cars to drive. Anyone driven a Hummer? Yeah. But that's where I had a bit of a problem, because disaster struck. When I was there, I got the dreaded phone call. Mary, my wife, had fallen off her horse. Everyone expected me to fall off the bike, but in that, she fell off her horse and very badly damaged her ankle. And so I got the dreaded phone call. And it's a terrible thing to happen, actually, when you get a phone call like that. And she was in hospital with a shattered ankle. So I really didn't know what to do. I had the bike, so I just wanted to get home. So I tried to ship the bike from Houston, but I couldn't. So I ended up crossing America in just 2.5 days to get to Los Angeles. So the trip didn't cover much there, but I just dropped in at White Sands. That's an amazing place, the White Sand missile place. Extraordinary. And yes, it's where they test their missiles. A little further up is where they tested the atom bomb. And they've now got this museum with all these amazing old missiles, Pershings and Sidewinders and all these sort of things. They've also got a German World War II V2 rocket. It was restored in 2004. Fascinating place to go, well worth going. There's so many places to go. So I then dashed across to America to, yes, it's very beautiful, but I didn't get any time to see it. I just managed to have breakfast with the boys at the Peggy Sue Diner. Oh, they're wonderful, those diners, those American diners. You know, they're all the girls with their little bobby socks, and they have the bottomless cup of coffee and they get egg and bacon. And they're wonderful places. So I enjoyed that. But then I had to get to I got to Los Angeles. I dumped poor old Azulo in at the customs, and Azulo was shipped home, and I flew home. And there's Mary. When I got home, she was enjoying a nice glass of red and she was on the mend, so that was good. So I was pleased to be home. So it was a wonderful trip, as all these trips are. These trips to me are a bit like a drug, you know. I just love them because you see so much, and when you're on your own, people talk to you, and you have a lot of fun actually. But as I say, I'm grounded now, so I'm not allowed to go anywhere. Yeah, so thank you very much.
We don't really have time for questions, but Geoff is staying for lunch. He's our guest at lunch.
Oh, I guess.
Yeah, our guest. And I'd like his great friend Rod Kelly to come in.
What an honour. As usual, it's just a fantastic presentation. I just feel for the poor bugger who's got to do next month's presentation. I just can't believe the things that he does, and every time I see things like this, there's more and more that I've never known about. And just wonderful stories.
Thank you.
Well done. I look forward to it.